welcome everybody. My name is Erin Kanzig. I'm the Drinking Water Program Director at River Network, and we're excited to be embarking on some advocacy recommendations during today's call related to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Um, Before we turn it over to our wonderful guest speaker, Janet, who's not really a guest. She's just an expert speaker, but she's part of all of this work. We'd love to just do a quick recap of who the state uh, SRF Advocates Forum is, as well as get to know you a little bit. So I know that those of you who have been on for a few minutes have heard me say this 3 times now, but if you could please introduce yourself in the chat, we love to see who is in attendance. We appreciate that. And then I just want to do a quick recap on the SRF State Advocates Forum. The forum is convened by River Network, Alliance for the Great Lakes, Policy Link, and EPIC. And the forum has now been around for a couple of years. Over 200 folks from across the country are engaged in this space, where we are working towards equitable water infrastructure investment. We have a wonderful website that houses a whole bunch of resources for you to check out, including fact sheets, recorded calls, and a resource bank, among other advocacy tools. So encourage you to go there and explore that. And then I would like to just say again, welcome to this call. Our first couple of sessions, we've covered the basics of what the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is. If you missed that and you're not sure what the Clean Water SRF program is, we do have that recording available. And then a couple weeks ago, we had American Rivers guest speakers talk a bit about green infrastructure and climate resiliency projects as it relates to the Clean Water SRF. And this time around, we're going to be focusing on advocacy with Janet. Janet Pritchard is a well-known SRF resource for many of us. If you spent any time engaging in conversations about SRFs, you've probably heard or read some of Janet's exemplary work. Janet is the Director of Water Infrastructure Policy at EPIC and is based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Her career has focused on the intersection of equity concerns and regulatory policy. And at EPIC, she works on state policy frameworks governing the SRFs. So as norms and tools for defining and addressing environmental justice concerns are evolved and prioritized, such as through the bipartisan infrastructure law, Janet works to fill a critical link by exploring how these norms and tools can be incorporated into state policy frameworks to prioritize communities that are in greatest need of water infrastructure investments. So we're happy to have Janet here. Before I totally turn it over to her, I am going to do like a 3-second recap of the last session. And again, we have the recording of that available if you want to check it out. And slides and additional resources were sent out to all registrants of that session. And if you would like that information and hadn't registered for the second sessions, I'm happy to forward that to you. Just drop me a chat. But we heard from American Rivers a couple of weeks ago on the many co-benefits of green infrastructure to public health, climate resilience, economic opportunities, and community cohesion. They covered a little bit about the basics of the Green Project Reserve, which is part of the Clean Water SRF that's dedicated towards green infrastructure, energy efficiency, and some other climate-related priorities. And they also went over some processes in which some states are trying to increase the number of projects that get funding for green and natural infrastructure. So Janet's going to go a little bit more into some of those different policy opportunities in a little bit. And so I'll be handing over to Janet pretty soon here, and then we will have time for an interactive activity where we'll have some breakouts and then open it up for a Q&A and discussion at the end. I keep saying I should have put my intro to Janet last. Sorry, y'all. I'm like, oh, I have more slides. But also just want to plug that we have an SRF advocacy toolkit that does have more background foundational knowledge around the SRFs, as well as examples from advocates on what they're doing to advocate for improvements to their programs. I encourage you to check that out to understand the why, what, and how of SRF advocacy. Okay, now for real, that's my slide for next time. For real, I'm going to turn it over to Janet. She'll start her presentation here shortly. Thanks all.
Thanks so much, Erin, and good to see you all here with the interest in advocating in your states around bringing more SRF funds to green infrastructure. I am going to hopefully share my screen, so just give me a moment to try to put that in place. There we go. Okay, so you all should be seeing my screen now. I put it in slideshow mode. You good? All right. So what I hope to talk to you about today is 3 tiers of advocacy that you could consider in engaging your state SRF programs. And I'm gonna spend some time in this presentation talking through in more detail and giving examples of the first 2 tiers. I think in the interest of time, I might not get so much to the 3rd tier, but I'm going to share these slides as well. Erin will share them with you. And there's also hot links in the slides and things that you might find useful after today's session as well. Oops, now I'm not able to advance my slides. There we go. So what are those 3 tiers of advocacy? Well, the first is simply clarifying current policies that may already allow SRF funding for GI, but maybe there's some confusion or a lack of awareness around that, what's actually possible already. But by clarifying what is possible, that in itself can help to spur more GI project applications and awards. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit, because you're not asking the state to change their policy. You're just asking them to elevate and lift up the policies that already exist. The second one is adapting familiar SRF policy tools to incentivize and prioritize GI projects. So these are tools that might be used for other kinds of goals that the SRF program is pursuing, and they could easily be adapted for advancing more GI projects. And then the 3rd tier is innovating new programs specifically tailored for GI projects. This is a bigger lift, requires a stronger will, more creativity, more capacity on the part of the state. But there are states doing interesting things and more innovative options to advance GI. So that's also a consideration. Well, let's move on and get into some of the details. So first, for clarification, I'm going to give 3 examples. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just examples of the kinds of things that just by clarifying what already exists in your state, you might see better outcomes for GI from your SRF. Okay, and we're going to go through each of these in turn through the slides. So the first thing is to recognize that municipalities can use SRF funding to finance the entire establishment period of a GI project. Now, what do I mean by establishment period? Well, let's take the example of a bioswale. Year 1, you might actually, clear the land, install the drains, install the vegetation, the topsoil, the gravel, all the different elements, the curb cuts, all those kind of construction elements of a bioswale. However, that bioswale is not really going to be functioning fully and performing the benefits that it's expected to perform until about 3 or even longer, 3 to 5 years into the process, when those new plantings really take root and can be pretty self-sustaining after that. So a lot of times project planners assume that when they think about capital costs, because it's important to remember that the SRF programs, like a lot of other infrastructure funding programs out there, they're designed to pay for the capital build costs of infrastructure. You're not allowed to pay for ongoing maintenance of that infrastructure once it's built. The misunderstanding for GI is around what counts as capital costs. And that's where this establishment period is very important. A GI installation is not fully built until the end of that establishment period. That's when it's functioning as it's intended to, and it actually takes 3 growing seasons, for example, for that installation to be established. So the costs are higher, the so-called maintenance costs are higher during those first 2 years, where the bioswale, for example, will need a lot more tending. It'll need more weeding. It'll need the engineers to come back and assess how it's functioning, all of those things. Those costs for that, that work of weeding and assessment through those first 3-4 years, whatever is the appropriate period for the installation we're talking about, those are all capital costs, and they should be categorized and accounted as capital, not as maintenance costs. I've presented on this at a couple conferences and to audiences that are filled largely with, municipalities or local water utilities that would like to do more GI, but they feel like it's hard to get funding for it because they don't realize that they actually can count a lot more costs in terms of what they could get from the SRF or other capital finance programs. So that's a really important clarification that I think can be a real aha moment for some communities. EPIC has produced a report in collaboration with Water Now on this topic and going into a lot more detail around how and why establishment costs should be accounted this way. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to take a look at the full report, which is available on our website and hot linked here. Some other areas where providing more clarification can be extremely helpful is in relation to the prioritization of projects within the SRF program. So often GI projects can receive points within the existing project prioritization scheme. Again, it might not be clear that that's the case. And that's because, and a good example is what had existed in Wisconsin. The regulations laid out the different things for which you could get points in the project scoring scale. And in many cases, it would also give examples of the kinds of projects that might fulfill certain criteria and win those points. However, it was found that even though green infrastructure projects would fulfill many of the sort of point gaining metrics, green infrastructure wasn't specifically called out as like, by the way, green infrastructure could get you these points. And so simply by inserting that clarification can make a difference. So here we see some examples of the project scoring criteria text, and then just adding in that clarification. So for example, in the first checked example here, it says that connected drainage areas associated with stormwater projects shall be awarded points. And there's a number, how many points they can get based on different factors. Simply by inserting this green phrase, including projects capturing stormwater with green infrastructure, shall be awarded points as follows. Okay. Likewise, another one that says stormwater projects that provide sediment removal can be awarded points as follows. Again, to clarify, green infrastructure could qualify for these points, right? Provided that they are geared to provide that sediment removal, which many would be. And then the final one, it points out that infiltration projects, if a stormwater project provides for infiltration, you can get points. Again, just noting that green infrastructure is one way to achieve this can be helpful. Note that in this final example, it was also suggested that you provide a little bit more points if the infiltration is provided through green infrastructure, and slightly less if it's a infiltration that is done through some kind of gray infrastructure instead. Just as a little boost to encourage communities to consider green infrastructure first, and they'll get a few more points. Okay. Now, there's a lot more detail on this Wisconsin example in some comments that Water Now provided on Wisconsin's Clean Water SUP. Sorry, IUP. So I've linked those comments also into this slide deck, and I think you'd find it really useful to look at that example of comments if this is an area that you're interested in advocating in as well. So another area where clarification is important is in relation to whether or not the SRF can fund GI projects on private property. Now, in some states, in fact, there's regulations that will not allow the use of the SRF funds in this way. But in many states, it is allowable under certain conditions. But again, there's a lack of awareness. There's often confusion about this point, even where it is technically allowed. And there can be confusion about exactly what the conditions are that would enable this and how to fulfill them. So again, just inserting into the the relevant text, the IUP, the regulations, the guidance materials that the state is doing on these points, to just add language highlighting and lifting up this possibility can be very helpful. Again, this is another area that was raised in the same set of Water Now comments on Wisconsin's IUP, and I urge you to take a look at that through the link if this is an area of interest. Another thing I want to highlight is that it's also possible to procure, normally, advocates working on GI will be thinking primarily of the green, of the clean water SRF. But there is an important way in which the drinking water SRF can also provide funds for this kind of work. And that's through one of the set-aside channels that are available from the drinking water SRF. Now, as you may know, states are allowed to set aside some of its federal capitalization grant and direct those funds through set-aside channels for certain purposes. One of the things that states can do on the drinking water side is they can set aside up to 10% of their federal capitalization grant each year to support activities such as land acquisition or conservation easements that will protect source waters, protect the groundwater and the surface waters from which drinking water sources are drawn. These funds could also be used to help communities conduct background studies and other kinds of assistance or partnership building that could lead to an application under Clean Water Act Section 319, which relates to non-point pollution projects. So that's also an important area to look if you're interested in that kind of work, particularly if your work focuses on agricultural settings or other kinds of conservation easement possibilities. And the EPA has produced some useful materials and case studies on how this can be done. So that's also linked in the slide deck. So next, the next tier that I've talked about is adapting policy tools to lift up the possibility of directing SRF funds to green infrastructure. And this is an adaptation of tools that states are already using, to achieve other goals. So what does this include? Targeting principal forgiveness to GI projects, discounting interest rates for GI projects, reserving a certain amount of the SRF funding pot for GI projects. Now, one example of this kind of carve out of funds for a certain type of projects is the Green Project Reserve, which I understand American Rivers folks talked about in the last session, as Aaron mentioned. Currently, the Green Project Reserve does include GI projects. So what this is, just to recap, it's federal law requires that 10% of the clean water SRF be reserved for what's considered green projects under that law, which includes GI, but also includes energy efficiency projects and water efficiency projects. And the suggestion here is that you could use the same kind of tool to say, well, let's reserve an extra 5% expressly just for GI projects. What this does is it allows sort of those projects to really jump to the top of the queue and be eligible for this reserved funding, at least until it's exhausted. Another tool that can be adapted is how project prioritization points are allocated. So to modify the project prioritization scheme to give extra points for GI. Now, this could either be a general sort of points, if your project is a GI project and define what's meant by GI there, you get an extra 20 points. Or it could be a little bit more complicated, like that example that I was giving earlier that gave 3 points for stormwater projects that provide for infiltration, where in that case it said, well, if it's GI, you get 3 points. If it's not GI, you get 2 points. So the same kind of water quality benefits, but giving a boost when those benefits are achieved through GI. This is a way of incentivizing, all those other co-benefits that we can get from GI that we don't get if we instead use the gray infrastructure to, achieve similar water quality outcomes. Some other examples are targeting technical assistance. Both the clean water and the drinking water SRF allow for states to set aside a portion of their federal capitalization grants and use this for technical assistance, particularly to smaller and low capacity communities. So states could develop technical assistance programs that are targeted specifically toward helping communities identify appropriate GI projects and put together applications for SRF funds for those projects. Aside from that kind of targeted technical assistance, states could just do a better job of broader public engagement and proactive outreach around GI projects and the possibility of funding GI projects with SRFs. The kind of guidance that clarifies some of the questions that I was talking about earlier would be one example of this. Loan guarantees are also a type of SRF assistance that can be provided that is generally underutilized. I'm not going to go into detail about how that's relevant in this GI context, but EPIC has written a blog that goes into more detail and provides a case study of that kind of assistance. So I urge you to click through that on the slide deck if you're interested on that. And again, we have other sort of materials, blogs, and further details on these points that I've linked in here. So as I mentioned, the third tier is more innovative programs within the SRF programs that are targeted to GI. The two that I'd like to just highlight briefly by reference are sponsorship programs and pass-through lending programs. I'm not going to take the time now in the interest of time to go through these in detail, but I encourage you to look at the slides to get a general overview and reach out to me if you're interested in learning more and really want to try to pursue these options in your state or community. So that's all for the presentation now, and back to you, Erin.
All right, thank you so much, Janet. Before we go into the breakouts, Janet, am I allowed to ask you one question before we break up?
Of course.
I was just wondering, if folks have never engaged in SRF advocacy before, could you just give a quick overview on like what the main ways that you're seeing folks engage in that advocacy? Like, what are the methods of advocacy? Who should they be advocating these changes to?
Yeah, thanks. Important question. Yeah, so the work that I'm doing and what I'm presenting on here is really oriented toward what's happening at the state level to either that could be, or what could be done at the state level to encourage more SRF funds for GI projects. So that means we're looking at state policies and practices in relation to the state SRF funds. So the two ways to advocate in relation to this is one, to just try to establish a relationship with the agency and the staff people at the agency in your state that actually runs the SRF program for your state. In most states, this for the clean water funds, this will typically be in one of the environmental agencies, Department of Natural Resources, a state environmental protection agency, something like that. For drinking water SRFs, it's sometimes in an environmental agency, sometimes in a health agency. So it'll vary. Sometimes some states have sort of environmental loan banks, so they might go under different names, but you can find out, who is the agency in your state and reach out to the staff there to learn more about the program, to ask your questions, to suggest your ideas, and just beginning to form a relationship with them through requesting a meeting is a great first step, and just looking at the website, for that agency, etc. Another way to engage is that every state needs to produce a intended use plan every year in order to receive its federal capitalization grant, which is the federal funding that helps to boost and provide new income into the SRF each year. And in order to receive that, and of course, the states aren't just relying on that federal money coming through each year, but also the revolving funds that are cycling through when prior loans are repaid into the fund. But to get that new federal grant, they have to do an intended use plan. And that intended use plan, or IUP, spells out the policies that determine how that money is going to be distributed. And when they publish the IUP, they also have to allow for a comment period, typically around 30 days in most states, for interested parties to submit comments and reactions to the IUP and the policies that are explained there. And some states will also have public hearings on their IUP or informational webinars on their IUP. So these are also opportunities to engage on and influence these policies.
Thank you so much for that rundown, Janet.
Yep.
Super helpful context. All right. I know sometimes people jump off of calls when there's breakout rooms, but I promise these are going to be fruitful conversations. So I encourage you all to stick around, and then we'll come back as a group to have a discussion and also ask Janet some additional questions. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. For the next 10 minutes, we would like to have you break out by interest. So you get to pick these 3 different topics. If you want to learn more about how to engage with at the local level, with planners or utility staff on how to tap into the clean water SRF green infrastructure project potentials, you'll join breakout room 1. If you want to talk more with Janet about how to revise your state's SRF program to increase green infrastructure projects, join breakout room 2. And then the third one, which we didn't talk as much about on this call, but might be of interest to some folks in certain states. If you're interested in decentralized wastewater treatment or failing septic tank issues and want to learn about advocacy around that topic, you'll join breakout room 3. And while we do that, we have a Jamboard where you can add your ideas and questions. There are 2 per breakout room. So the first 2 slides will be for breakout room 1. You just keep clicking through to find the other breakout room slides. We'll have some point people in each of the breakouts to help you navigate this and get the conversation started. So with that, I am going to launch the breakout rooms. Please pick the topic that you are interested in. We'll do this for 10 minutes and then reconvene. Okay, I'm seeing some of you are requesting. You can pick them yourself, but if you need my help, I will manually move you to them. Just give me a moment. All right. I'm seeing people filter out to their respective breakout rooms. All right. Uh, Trinity, Claire, and Amanda, are you with us? And do you need any help getting into a breakout room? All right, I'm putting you all in room 2. If you want to move, you can hop back out. Zoom is so curious. It said it was ending, and then it's like, well, where's everyone else? I don't know. I think they'll be back here.
I don't envy that because I don't understand how to work Zoom like that. I wasn't on Zoom throughout the pandemic to know how to work breakout rooms and stuff.
And it's like a thing that I don't do often enough to become good at. I'm like, okay, is this actually working? Eddie, thank you for sharing the link to your website. All right, here come folks. Welcome back. I know that that was brief, but I hope that having that space to talk and ask questions and share your experiences was useful to you all. I see that we did get some good notes added to the Jamboard. If you want to continue to add to that, you can, and you all have access to this. So if you want to refer back to it later, I'll include it in our email follow-up as well. But yeah, I'd like now just to open up this space, maybe based on what rose to the top for you in your breakouts. If you want to share any observations or ask questions, the room is yours. So if you want to just use the raise hand feature or just come off mute, if you're more comfortable asking in the chat, any of those ways is great.
I think Jenna was finishing explaining why there's hesitancy to use loans for green infrastructure projects. And I wanted to know why. I think I know, but I don't know for sure.
It was my fault. The countdown was going, Erin, and I still started talking. So we were talking about partnering with local municipalities or agencies responsible for implementing GSI. And in the overlay with loan-based programs like the SRF program, even though as was laid out really articulately by Janet, there are set-asides and forgiveness for green stormwater projects. There is still some loan component, and the payback over time for green stormwater infrastructure is often lacking because in some states there are legal impediments or policy impediments to fee-based programs associated with stormwater, which means that they don't have that funding coming in like you would for a sewering agency on the back end to fund operations and maintenance or to repay the loan. So that's one of the bigger issues. The other is that taking on the loan means that they may not also they may not have the perception of a loan is typically not as great as having a grant, and grants are not doled out near as frequently out of the SRF program as I think they should be. That's what I was going to say.
Thank you.
Other questions? Or just, I guess we'll just can also move from group to group. If group 2 had any insights that they think are important to share with the rest of the group, or questions that emerged that weren't answered.
Well, in group 2, we had a very small group, and we focused in on the option that I mentioned in my slide presentation around directing set-asides from the drinking water SRF for conservation easements or land trusts kind of work, and just had a more general conversation about some states' reluctance to use set-aside funds, and some of the concerns that they raise, and maybe some arguments to also push back against that and explain why using more set-aside funds can be very beneficial and strategic. So that our conversation sort of circled around that. And one thing I noted in relation to that is that states will often say that they don't want to use set-aside funds because they want to reserve as much money as they can to be loaning out for projects. and get those funds and, you know, returning and revolving through the fund. But one counterpoint to that is that, you know, some states, I've heard states make that argument as a reason why they don't set aside more of their funds. And the reality is they're not even fully utilizing all the funds they already have available for lending. So it's kind of a hollow, it's a hollow rationale that they say we're conserving this for lending, and they have unused loan funds already. And for those that are fully utilizing their funds, you know, they can leverage their funds to expand their loan funds. But the things that they can do through set-aside channels are somewhat unique and can be very beneficial in terms of kind of the bang for the buck. And it's an opportunity to kind of, you know, for some of the local assistance programs, like the one I pointed to in the presentation, kind of a way of kind of turning these funds into more grant funds in a way. And so I think it's worth raising, you know, some states are more resistant than others to using set-asides, but I do encourage you to explore encouraging states to use more of their set-aside funds, both for technical assistance and for these kind of more, you know, targeted purposes like source water protection.
Does anyone in my group? I'd love to have someone else speak rather than me. Does anyone from group 3 want to raise up any of their local experiences in their states around decentralized wastewater treatment systems and failing septic tanks and how it relates to the Clean Water SRF program? Ideas that you have? Questions?
Yeah, our group was all pretty different. We had perspectives from California and Iowa, which is something I've never heard of before, and Mississippi. So we all came from 3 very different viewpoints.
All right. I don't want to pull questions out of you all, so we can move along if that is what the group would like. Just as to wrap up, again, such huge thanks to Janet for joining us today. A couple of other opportunities that I wanted to flag for you all is that River Network is launching our second annual SRF Advocacy Training Cohort. It's a 9-week series that is going to get started in March. If you are interested in diving into all of these issues and more, please fill out our interest form, which is due on February 9th. And we also are always striving to improve the webinars, learning sessions that we offer. So we have a short survey link we also would love to share with you all. And then I'll just say that if you haven't joined the SRF State Advocates Forum and you are an advocate from a nonprofit or a community-based organization and would like to join, we have a Mobilize group, which is an online platform where we connect and share. And that is a great place to participate and learn more from others from potentially your own state or other states. And we also host quarterly national calls. Those are yet to be scheduled for 2024, but be on the lookout. We'll be sharing information about those soon. Any last words, Janet?
No, I'll just encourage you all, you know, in your advocacy around these issues, and don't hesitate to turn to our website or reach out to myself personally if you have further questions. I also want to give a shout out to my new colleague who's on the call. Pete Hill is someone who just joined our team last week with a focus on green infrastructure, and those of you in his breakout session might have learned that he has a deep and rich background in this area. So we're hoping to expand our our engagement and value in this space with Pete's help. So hope to be working with all of you in the future, and really welcome your thoughts and suggestions around what your needs are and what you're trying to do, ways that we might help as we're shaping and building out our program in this area.
All right. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to join us. We'll be sending out follow-up materials in the next week or so. And take care. All right. Bye.